the capture and the betrayal. Leora's heart raced as the cold metal of the ship's hull vibrated beneath her. Her mind was sharp and calculating, always alert. She was an elite warrior, trained for combat and espionage, but nothing had prepared her for the sudden capture. She had been ambushed during what was supposed to be a covert mission to gather intel on human military activity. It had been a clean strike. Her forces had been one step ahead, but the humans had somehow anticipated her every move. She had fought fiercely, but it hadn't been enough. Now she found herself shackled and locked in a sterile, dimly lit cell in a human facility. She hadn't seen much of the humans since her capture, but she could hear them speaking outside her cell, their voices muffled by the thick walls. It only made her more anxious. What would they do to her? She had heard the rumors of how human soldiers treated alien prisoners, of the brutal interrogations and endless tortures. She knew what awaited her. Leora wasn't afraid, though. Fear was for the weak. She had seen her comrades fall in battle, their bodies left to rot in the harsh alien world that they called home. The survival of her species was always on the line, and she had accepted that sacrifice long ago. What bothered her wasn't the idea of death. It was the idea of being subjected to the whims of humans. She had always seen them as primitive, reckless, and beneath her kind. But now, here she was at their mercy, locked in a cage, awaiting her fate. The door to her cell opened, and a human soldier entered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that studied her intently. He wasn't wearing the usual heavy armor that most soldiers wore. Instead, he wore a simple uniform with no distinguishing marks, as though he were just a regular officer. Leora stood, her posture straight and proud. She was battered, bruised from the fight, but she would never show weakness. The soldier hesitated, his hand hovering near the door for a moment before stepping fully inside. "Are you here to break me?" Leora's voice was low, but it carried the weight of authority. "Or are you just here to watch?" The soldier's expression didn't change. He stepped closer to the bars of her cell, his eyes scanning her for any sign of fear or resistance. Leora could see the hint of curiosity in his gaze, something that she hadn't expected. "I'm not here to watch," he said, his voice calm, almost distant. "I'm here to make sure you don't escape." Leora laughed bitterly. "Escape? What good would escape do? I'm already a prisoner. Your people already own my fate." He didn't respond right away, his fingers tapping on the side of the cell. "Maybe," he said after a long pause, "but I don't think you're as resigned to your fate as you pretend." Leora narrowed her eyes. The soldier was testing her. He was trying to gauge her reaction, see if there was any weakness in her resolve. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Why don't you come closer?" she taunted, a cruel smile curling at the corners of her mouth. "Or are you afraid of an alien?" His lips twitched, but he didn't move closer. Instead, he stepped back and took a breath. "I'll be back," he said cryptically, before turning and exiting the cell, leaving Leora alone in the dark silence once more. Her mind raced. What was this soldier's game? She had seen many like him in her lifetime, humans who acted tough, who pretended to have control over the situation. But she wasn't fooled. Leora had been in far worse situations before. Whatever game he was playing, she would play it better. She wasn't going to break so easily. Little did she know, this soldier was unlike any she had encountered before. Derek had already begun to see her not as a prisoner, but as someone with a story to tell, a story he hadn't yet fully understood. And as the days passed, the walls between them would begin to crumble piece by piece. The unexpected offer. The days blurred together for Leora. The routine was grueling, but she had grown accustomed to it. She was fed just enough to keep her alive, though she would have preferred to starve than accept anything the humans offered. Each morning, she was checked by a medical officer who inspected her injuries, but they never seemed to care for her well-being, just enough to ensure she remained functional for whatever purposes they had planned for her. Her cell was as sterile and cold as the environment outside, and her only interaction was with the guards who came by in shifts, bringing her food or occasionally, in order to stand for a security check. But on one particular day, there was a noticeable shift. Derek, the soldier who had visited her the first day, returned. Leora had grown used to him checking on her periodically, but this time, something was different. He didn't stand at the door and stare from a distance, as he had done before. Instead, he stepped into the cell, his face unreadable, but his eyes carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. "I've been reassigned to keep watch over you," Derek said, his voice steady but not without an edge of something Leora couldn't quite place. "We need to talk." She arched an eyebrow. "Talk," she scoffed. "I have no interest in conversation with my captors." Derek didn't seem offended. He simply glanced around, his eyes flicking to the corners of the dim room. "This isn't what I signed up for, Leora. I'm not like the others. I know you're not just some mindless alien warrior." Leora's heart skipped. He knew her name. That meant he had done more than his usual cursory check on her. "You're wasting your time," she said, though something in her voice faltered, betraying the tiniest hint of curiosity. "Why come to me with your sympathies now? Do you think I'll break for a few kind words?" Derek hesitated, his gaze softening for a moment before he quickly masked it. "No, I'm not here to apologize or try to break you, but I'm here to offer you a choice." Leora's eyes narrowed as she studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception. This human was far different from the cold, indifferent officers she had encountered before. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. Perhaps he was trying to manipulate her into trusting him, only to deceive her later. "A choice," she repeated, scoffing. "What choice could you possibly offer me? I am your prisoner, chained to this wretched place." Derek stepped closer to the bars that separated them. His voice dropped, almost to a whisper, yet it carried an undeniable sincerity. "You can stay here, submit to whatever they plan for you, or you can come with me. I can get you out of here, Leora." Leora's heart pounded in her chest. Was he serious? Her mind reeled. The idea of escape, of freedom, was almost too enticing to consider. But she couldn't trust him. He was still human, and she had learned long ago that humans were deceitful, willing to do anything to achieve their goals. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "Why take such a risk? What's in it for you?" Derek didn't flinch. Instead, he took a long breath, his eyes locking with hers in an almost unnervingly direct gaze. "Because," he began slowly, "I don't believe in what we're doing here. I don't believe in the war, the violence, the way we're treating people like you. I've seen enough to know it's wrong. And maybe I'm doing this because I want to prove to myself that I'm better than what they say we are." Leora could hardly believe the words coming from his mouth. A human soldier, one of her captors, was telling her that he didn't believe in his own cause. It was almost absurd. "That sounds like a convenient excuse to justify your actions," she said sharply. "What makes you think I'll trust you after everything?" Derek stepped back, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the conversation. "I don't expect you to trust me, not yet. I know it's a lot to ask. But if you want out of here, I can make it happen. I don't know if I can save you, but I can at least try." Leora stood in silence, contemplating his words. Escape would mean breaking every rule she had ever lived by, every principle she had been taught. To trust a human after everything she had experienced seemed like madness. But something inside her stirred, an impulse she couldn't ignore. Derek was offering her a chance to fight back, a chance to take control of her destiny once more. "And what happens when they find out what you did?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "When your superiors learn you've broken protocol?" Derek's expression darkened. "Then we both run together." Leora studied him for a long moment. She didn't believe in human kindness. She had seen too much of their cruelty and brutality. But there was something in his eyes, something raw and vulnerable, that made her hesitate. For a moment she wondered if she was making a mistake. But at that moment she realized that there was no going back. For better or worse, this human had offered her a chance she couldn't afford to ignore. "What's the plan?" Leora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek smiled, but there was no joy in it, only determination. "We move tonight." The plan to escape. The cold, sterile walls of her cell had become a constant in Leora's life. It was a place she had resigned herself to, even though every corner seemed to whisper of a future she had no control over. But now, with Derek's words still ringing in her ears, everything felt different. She couldn't ignore the flutter of hope that stirred deep within her. Leora had never been one to rely on anyone, let alone a human, but here she was, standing in the dim light of her cell, considering a decision that could change everything. Derek had given her a choice, a real choice, a chance for freedom, but it came at a price: trust, a commodity Leora had long ago given up on. Derek's plan was simple, but its execution was anything but. He had been working under the radar for months, quietly gathering information, observing the weaknesses in the facility's security systems. He had studied the guards, the patrols, the schedules, everything that would be necessary for a successful escape. But now that Leora had to become part of it, the stakes had changed. "Are you sure you can get me out of here?" Leora asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and urgency. The guards, the cameras, the lockdowns, they're everywhere. Derek nodded, the lines on his face deepening. He looked less like a soldier and more like a man burdened with a mission. I've already mapped the facility. The cameras can be hacked. The guards, well, I know their schedules. And there's a service tunnel that leads out of the main compound. If we get to it, we can make it to the outer perimeter where there's a transport vehicle waiting. Leora's eyes searched Derek's face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any hint that he was bluffing. But his expression remained firm, resolute. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but after everything she had endured, it was hard to allow herself to hope. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice quieter now. She wasn't asking about the plan anymore. She was asking about her time in this prison, how long before she would lose the courage to fight for her freedom. Derek hesitated. "A few days. They're doing a routine inspection of the outer barriers. There will be less activity for about 48 hours. After that, the chances of us getting out undetected are slim." Leora nodded, her mind racing. A small window of opportunity. 2 days. She had 2 days to make a choice that would either set her free or plunge her back into the hell she had fought so hard to escape. The thought of being locked in a cage once more, subjected to human cruelty, was unbearable. She couldn't go back to that. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady but filled with an underlying determination. "I'll do it. I'll escape with you." Derek's face softened for a moment, though he quickly masked it. He didn't allow himself to show relief. This was no time for such things. But there was a glint of something in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the risk they both faced. "We'll have to move fast," he said, his tone now all business. "I'll start the preparations tonight. You'll need to be ready when I give the signal. Stay alert, stay quiet, and don't draw attention to yourself." Leora nodded. She had no intention of making noise. The quiet was her ally now. Every sound could give her away, every misstep could mean the difference between freedom and death. As Derek left her cell to begin his part of the plan, Leora sat down on the cold metal bench, her thoughts swirling. She could hardly believe this was happening. She could hardly believe someone was willing to risk everything for her. After all the pain, the humiliation, the loss, could she really believe this was her chance to escape it all? But something about Derek's unwavering resolve made her wonder if he was telling the truth. Something in the way he spoke, in the way he had looked at her, told her that he wasn't lying. He wasn't doing this out of some misplaced sense of duty or to earn favor. He was doing it because he truly believed it was the right thing to do. Leora shook her head. She couldn't afford to get distracted by hope. Hope was a dangerous thing to cling to in a place like this. But for the first time in months, she allowed herself the smallest flicker of it. The next day, everything seemed like it was falling into place. Derek had been efficient, as always. He came by Leora's cell again, but this time, his visit wasn't just to check on her. He had a small device in his hand, a tiny piece of tech that would be essential for their escape. It was a hacking tool designed to disable the facility's security system long enough for them to get through undetected. "This is it," Derek said, his voice low. "I'll disable the outer defenses during the inspection. That's when we'll make our move." Leora took the device from him, feeling the weight of it in her hand. "I'll be ready," she said. Derek gave her a quick nod, then turned to leave, his eyes scanning the hallway cautiously before he disappeared. The hours stretched on as Leora prepared herself for what was to come. Her mind was a constant whirl of conflicting emotions. There was fear, yes, but there was also something else. Something she hadn't felt in so long. Freedom. It was within her grasp. All she had to do was reach out and take it. Night fell and the facility began to quiet down. Leora knew that now was the time. Her heartbeat quickened as she slipped into her uniform, the one they had provided her when she first arrived. It was plain, designed for ease of movement, and now it would serve as her disguise. If she was careful enough, no one would recognize her as the alien prisoner they had locked up. She waited, her body tense, every sense on high alert. The sound of footsteps grew louder as Derek approached her cell. When he stopped in front of the bars, his eyes met hers, and she knew that this was it. The moment she had waited for. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Leora nodded, her breath shallow. "Let's do this." The breakout. The quiet of the night was almost too perfect, too serene to be the calm before a storm. Leora's pulse pounded in her ears as she followed Derek down the narrow, dimly lit hallways. Every step felt like a countdown, every breath too loud for the silence. She could feel the weight of the decision on her shoulders now more than ever. There was no turning back. Escape wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a fragile, fleeting reality, and if they failed, there would be no second chances. Derek had been right about one thing. The facility was quieter at night. The guards were fewer, and the security systems had been temporarily disabled, just as promised. The only danger now was the unpredictability of human nature. Would they be discovered? Would they be stopped before they reached the exit? As they moved deeper into the bowels of the compound, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Derek stopped occasionally to check the hallway, making sure no one was coming. Leora kept her back against the cold concrete, her senses heightened, every corner a potential threat. "I've got this," Derek whispered, holding up a small device that looked like a mini-computer. He clicked a few buttons, and the red light on the device blinked once, twice, then went dark. The cameras along the hall flickered before going offline, leaving the entire corridor eerily quiet. Leora exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. "How much longer until we're out of here?" Derek gave her a sharp look. "Don't rush it, stay calm and keep moving." They continued forward, passing through several security checkpoints, each one more nerve-wracking than the last. Derek moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, but there was still tension in his movements, a hesitation in the way he glanced over his shoulder. He was worried. About Leora, about getting caught, about what would happen to them if they did. Leora couldn't help but wonder if he was second-guessing himself. Was he really willing to risk his life for her? She had to remind herself that Derek wasn't doing this for her. He was doing this because, deep down, he knew that what the facility was doing was wrong. That knowledge was what had driven him to make this choice, not just for her, but for his own sense of morality. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, each turn a potential trap. Derek stopped at another security door, a thick steel barrier that separated them from the next level of the compound. He pulled out a different device, this one larger and more intricate, and set to work. The sound of his fingers tapping on the screen echoed in the stillness, and Leora could feel her heart in her throat. "Almost there," Derek muttered under his breath. His voice was tense now, strained. She could see the sweat gathering on his brow. Leora placed her hand on the doorframe, steadying herself as the weight of their situation pressed in on her. This was the moment of truth. If this door didn't open, all of their work would be for nothing. They would be trapped, caught, and exposed. She glanced at Derek, his face illuminated only by the faint light of his device. His expression was tight, and she could see his jaw clench in frustration as he worked through the problem. "Come on," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "Come on." Leora's breath caught in her throat. They had been working for so long, had come so far, and if this door remained locked. Suddenly, with a soft beep, the door clicked open. Derek stepped back, a look of relief flooding his features. "We're through," he said, barely above a whisper. "Just one more door and we're out of here." Leora let out the breath she didn't even realize she was holding. "Let's go," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. They continued down another long corridor, and finally, Derek stopped in front of a heavy steel door, the final barrier between them and freedom. His fingers moved quickly over the control panel, and the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the service tunnel that led outside the facility. Leora's eyes widened. She could see the light at the end of the tunnel now, literally and figuratively. The outside world, freedom, was right there. A moment ago, it had seemed like an impossible dream, but now it was within her reach. "Once we get out, there's a transport waiting for us," Derek said, his voice calm but urgent. "We just need to make it through the tunnel." The air outside the facility was colder than Leora had expected, but it was also fresher, cleaner. As they crawled through the narrow tunnel, Leora felt a sense of liberation that she hadn't realized she'd been missing. For so long, she had been trapped in a cage of steel and concrete, but now, with every step, she was getting closer to her own freedom. There were still dangers ahead, but for the first time in ages, she had hope. They finally reached the end of the tunnel, where a small transport vehicle awaited them. Derek's face was grim as he scanned the area for any signs of movement. "We're not out yet," he warned, his voice tight. "We've got to move quickly. If we're spotted, it's all over." Leora nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. She followed Derek as he approached the transport, the vehicle small but sturdy. It was parked just outside the compound's walls in a small clearing surrounded by trees. Derek had clearly planned every detail down to the smallest factors. He motioned for Leora to get in, and as she climbed into the vehicle, Derek took the driver's seat and started the engine. The vehicle hummed to life, the sound of the engine a stark contrast to the silence of the night. Leora's heart raced. This was it, they were free. But even as the vehicle sped away from the compound, she knew the danger wasn't over. They had made it past the guards, the cameras, the high-tech security systems, but the world beyond the facility was a vast unknown. They would have to keep moving, stay hidden, and stay one step ahead of the people who would want to put her back into captivity. But for the first time, as the vehicle roared through the night, Leora allowed herself to believe that there was hope. Hope for a future where she wasn't a prisoner. Hope for a life where she could make her own choices. It wasn't over yet, but they had won their first victory. A new beginning. The vehicle hummed quietly as it sped through the night, the only light coming from the dim glow of the dashboard. Leora sat in the passenger seat, her body rigid with a mix of exhaustion, anticipation, and anxiety. She was free. They were free, but the world outside the compound was a vast and unpredictable place. She could still hear the echoes of guards shouting back at the facility, the alarms ringing in her head. How long would it be before they realized she was gone? How long before the pursuit began? But Derek's focus was unshakable. His hands gripped the steering wheel with determination as he navigated through the twisting roads, the headlights of their transport slicing through the darkness ahead. He wasn't looking back. He wasn't worried. That steadiness was one of the things that Leora had come to admire about him, despite the doubts that still gnawed at her. "How much further?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her throat was dry from the tension, and her entire body felt like it was still reeling from the adrenaline rush of their escape. Derek glanced at her, his eyes softening for a moment. "Not far. We just need to get to the safe house, and then we can lay low for a while." A safe house? It sounded so simple, but to Leora it represented a fragile hope. It meant protection, a brief respite from the danger that had stalked her for so long. But it also meant the beginning of a new life, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "You're sure no one will find us?" she asked, her voice more urgent now. "I don't want to drag you into this, Derek. You've already done so much." He shook his head, a reassuring smile flickering across his face. "You're not dragging me into anything. I made my choice, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Leora looked out the window, watching the world blur past them. The cold, sterile walls of the compound were miles away now, but the memories lingered. The torture, the fear, the loneliness. She had been held captive for so long, both physically and emotionally, that it felt almost impossible to believe she was actually out, that she had a chance at something better. But what was that better? What did freedom even look like for someone like her? Her thoughts were interrupted when Derek's voice broke through the silence. "We're here." Leora blinked and looked around, finding herself staring at a small, weathered building tucked away between a cluster of trees. It looked ordinary, unremarkable. But to her, it felt like the edge of something new. It was her escape, her sanctuary. Derek pulled the vehicle into the gravel driveway and turned off the engine. "Stay low," he warned, his voice serious. "We need to make sure no one saw us." Leora nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment where they were truly on their own, away from the clutches of the facility. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't have to look over her shoulder at every passing shadow. She could breathe. They climbed out of the vehicle, Derek leading the way to the back door of the safe house. It was a small building, more of a cabin, really nestled in a secluded part of the woods. Leora followed him inside, taking in the sparse but functional interior. There was a small kitchen, a living room with an old couch, and a staircase that led to a loft. It was humble, but it was a sanctuary. Derek locked the door behind them and walked to a small table where he set down a stack of maps and documents. "We need to plan our next move," he said, turning to face Leora. "This place isn't permanent. We'll need to keep moving, but for now, we're safe." Leora took a seat at the table, still processing everything. The escape, the freedom, and now this new life. She felt an overwhelming rush of gratitude for Derek, who had risked everything to get her here. He hadn't just saved her from the compound. He had given her a chance at life. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what to say." Derek's expression softened. "You don't have to say anything. We've both been through a lot, but I'm glad you made it out." Leora met his gaze, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Trust, hope, a sense of safety. For the first time, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be a future for her. Over the next few days, Derek and Leora stayed in the safe house, keeping a low profile as they planned their next steps. Derek had contacts in various parts of the world, people who could help Leora start a new life, far away from the people who wanted to exploit her. But for now, they were in hiding, cautious, biding their time. During the quiet moments in the safe house, Leora found herself watching Derek, wondering what motivated him to risk so much. He could have walked away. He could have left her to fend for herself, but instead he had gone above and beyond. He had given her something she had almost forgotten was possible, a future. Days turned into weeks and Leora started to heal. She wasn't just recovering physically, but emotionally too. She no longer felt like a captive, trapped by the memories of what had happened to her. She began to feel like she could make choices again, choices that were her own. And as the weeks passed, Derek and Leora grew closer. They weren't just allies anymore. There was something deeper between them now, something neither of them had expected. Leora could sense the hesitation in Derek at first, as if he wasn't sure how to navigate their growing connection. But it was undeniable. The bond they had forged in the fires of escape had turned into something far more profound. They weren't just survivors, they were a team. It was in the quiet moments, when Derek would sit with her in the evenings, talking about nothing and everything, that Leora realized the full extent of the gift he had given her. He had given her a chance to live again, to rebuild her life from the ground up. And for the first time in a long while, Leora allowed herself to believe in the future. She had been abandoned and hopeless, trapped in a world that sought to break her. But now she had a new future, one that she would shape, one where she could finally choose her path. As the days turned into months, Leora's trust in Derek deepened. She knew that together they could face whatever the world threw their way. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time it felt like a journey worth taking.